I could easily forgive his pride if he had not mortified mine. These words are from Jane Austen's second novel called Pride and Prejudice. This story has found ways to people's hearts throughout books, high-budget films, TV series, and I wanted to talk to you about it today. So if you fancy a ride, I would recommend to get a cup of tea and join me. So Jane, she started writing this novel in 1796 when she was just 21 years old, and it was published in 1813. 15 years later. And the reason for that is that the publishers have rejected the manuscript, and only after her first successful novel called Sense and Sensibility that was published in 1811 could the world enjoy her second novel, Pride and Prejudice, that was originally called First Impressions. It is curious that all novels of Jane were published anonymously, and Pride and Prejudice was presented as written by the author of Sense and Sensibility. So we have our protagonist, Elizabeth Bennet, from the Bennet's family, and in my opinion, she is one of the most important female characters in the whole literature, and that is because she unites so beautifully intelligence and great manners that were necessary for a woman of her century, with that power of expressing her own opinion and standing for it. And I think it's beautiful how she shows an example of tender and strong at the same time. So the story unfolds in 19th century when in London wealth was accumulated through the ownership of land, and our Bennets are members of upper middle class that was known as gentry, and though they were eligible to mix with aristocracy, they were quite beneath them in wealth. So they bared some financial burdens of providing for such a big family, and also by majorat, which is the order of inheritance of the property by which it goes to the eldest male of the family, Mr. Bennet's estate was entailed to go to the closest male heir. So with that being said, it doesn't surprise us how the novel starts. Mrs. Bennet persuades her husband to visit their new neighbor, Mr. Bingley, who is a young and rich bachelor, and she is hopeful that he might fall in love with one of her daughters. Mr. Bingley danced with Jane Bennet twice. She is the oldest of Bennet's sisters and happened to like her. However, Mr. Darcy refused to dance with Elizabeth and said, quote, "She is tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt me." And that is how the story of Elizabeth and Darcy starts. After meeting our protagonist on different occasions, Mr. Darcy happens to fall in love with her against his will because of inferiority of her connections and etc. And he proposes to her, and she happens to reject him, which is a very brave and courageous move for a woman of that century to reject a man like Darcy with his wealth and connections. Huge step forward in literature of establishing rights of a woman in a society. So the story ends with happy ending. Elizabeth falls in love with Darcy after seeing the truth behind his actions, and Jane, her sister, in spite of a number of difficulties, marries Mr. Bingley. And the idea of the story is quite clear. It is important to marry with love and not for convenience, as it was very important during those times. There's so many themes and ideas in the book that I wanted to go a bit deeper and wider. One of the main themes in the book is marriage, and it even acknowledges the problem of that society because they believed that women must marry a rich man with good fortune. It even starts with that. It says, single men with possessions should be looking for a wife. And that's why we have an example of a bad marriage. We have Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, and opposite of them, we have Elizabeth, that rejected Darcy when she didn't love him, and only after understanding his feelings and his actions and truly falling in love with him did she accept his proposal. Next theme is class, and wealth. Obviously, we see how big is the role of money and social status in finding life partners. We see Mrs. Bennet, and she's waiting for her daughters to marry rich because women's financial status completely depended on men, and inheritance also was restricted to male heirs only. We see Lady Catherine, Darcy's aunt, offended and vicious by the rumors of his nephew marrying a woman despite their social and financial differences. She actually says, quote, "Will the shades of Pemberley be thus polluted?" This and the fact that Darcy himself doubted his feelings for those exact reasons show us, I think, one of the main ideas of the novel, which is neither pride nor prejudice could survive after facing true and deep feelings of human souls, that real love that we see between Darcy and Elizabeth. Another important theme in the book is development of characters. Elizabeth reveals Darcy his mistakes during rejecting his proposal and recognizes actually her own mistakes, and they both start correcting them, forming their own opinions and not going by social rulebook. Elizabeth says, quote, "Till this moment I never knew myself," and I think that is an illustration of a strong character who can see a mistake, acknowledge it, correct it, and then go on. Opposite of that, we have Mrs. Bennet. When her youngest daughter Lydia ran away with Mr. Wickham, she didn't really face her faults, and the text actually says that. I think Elizabeth shows women of her century, and hell, every century, how to be strong and know your value despite of social or financial status. Flawless manners and intelligence bind with self-worth and power, and I think that's how we get one of the greatest women in literature. It is also interesting to notice that Darcy couldn't see flaws in Elizabeth that Miss Bingley was pointing out for him, and that is because, in my opinion, if the person deeply loves, there is no amount of pride or prejudice that could stop him. So this novel is definitely a revolution for its time. It shows the power of love, power of honesty, dignity, and most importantly, power of a woman. I am the happiest creature in the world. Perhaps other people have said so before, but not one with such justice. That is the power of love.